Hello, everybody. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin. Today, I will have a very interesting conversation with my great friend, Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hello, everyone. It's been a while. This is Chen, your old friend, and great honor to be here with you, Aran. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. And I'm also based in Austin, Texas. And today, I think we are doing kind of a second iteration of our manifesto. So, can you please just briefly mention what our uh, channel is about and why are we doing this manifesto a second time?
Of course. So, as we have talked about this from the very beginning, what the Versucher project is about at its core is finding a breeding room for vitality in investigation. And if we unpack that, what we have found suffocating in our corresponding disciplines and other disciplines that we're familiar with is that the academic discourse, with all of its merits, uh, it is inherently conservative in the wrong direction, meaning that it always sacrifices preserving the bureaucracy um, to expansion and creativity and innovation. And because of that, especially for the fields that we are in, there is going to be always a shortcomings and blind sides that seem to be simply forgotten or put aside for some form of a scholarly achievement. And our original issue that we discussed in the first manifesto was related to this point and dissatisfaction with the arbitrary disciplinary boundaries that we have faced, especially in humanities, and how it has influenced the role of humanities in our life and the relationship between humanities and our actual existence and relevance of it. And also how it hasn't been beneficial to, an in-depth inquiry that is not so tamed by pre-existing boundaries. We mentioned in the first manifesto that there is going to be more variations because what we care for here is not to set a final, list of books that we're going to go about, but to act dialectically, meaning that each move that we make, we want to respond to that and create the next move. And that's what is the essence of this project, which means that we might move around a lot. So this is not a channel about Hegel. This is not a channel about, Gillian Rose. This is not a channel about enlightenment. This channel could, like, in like 10 episodes from now, we might be talking about like chaos theory in very like kind of in-depth analysis of chaos theory and its role in some issues that we're interested in. That freedom is what we cherish and want to value, the dialectical freedom. Now, some of our concerns that we started with made us to start with the first Versucher project. I mentioned the disciplinary boundaries, but there were some specific questions that we had. And these questions were related to the point about disciplinary boundaries, but they were, more general questions that in had relevance in any humanities field and beyond. One of those examples, for instance, was the problem of universals, problem of individuals. What is the relationship between individual and universal? Which in return was also related to the question about cultural relativism, or versus some sort of absolute, some sort of a court of appeals of cultures, right? And as we mentioned, these questions between universals and individuals, um, the interesting thing about these questions is that they have presence in the most theoretical and distant domains of human knowledge, like theology, and also they're very much present in every political structure that we identify with or fight for or fight against, right? And concepts such as individuality in, for instance, the country that we're in right now, United States are the concepts that are discussed, but like they are discussed in debates, but never really, no one really thinks through them as much. They have been turned into slogans that actually really shape our lives in many ways. And every political question also has this kind of a trouble with thinking about like whether there is a Supreme Court of appeal or like something like an anarchistic situation is the path to go. So I'm mentioning this just to remind the listeners that the questions that we are having are going to be very theoretical, quote unquote, but the type of theoretical burden they have is actually very much reflected in how these concepts play out in our actual existence. Especially, and that was why we started with Isaiah Berlin and Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment debate. For human beings who are existing in the post-Enlightenment era, in our case specifically in a country that experienced the first post-Enlightenment political revolution, right? And in a space that the ideas of that revolution in political sense is just ever like we cannot escape from it, even if it is about rejecting it, which our home countries are very much determined to reject it. You cannot escape it as an existing concept. We think the question of the universals, the question about individuals, the question about cultural relativism, a concept like human rights as something that is universal and is applicable to any culture. These are debates that become very much quote unquote practical with the Enlightenment project. And that's how we took off. And there we discussed figures that we may return to later on. But we got interested in the role of Kant as a father of enlightenment in some ways. Not necessarily father of enlightenment, maybe in the political sense, like people like Mill and Locke have been far more important, but in the sense that Kant seems to be the most serious Enlightenment thinker when it comes to building a philosophical system that could find its place in every discipline of humanities. What we thought might be interesting was to engage with the basic aspect of Kant's approach, and see whether the problems that we see in all of these matters that I mentioned, disciplinary boundaries, non-dialectical understanding of space of knowledge, universals versus individuals, all the criticism that figures like Hamann have against the Enlightenment idea, so on and so forth. Why don't we go to the core? Why don't we go to Kant and see how we might be able to kind of change certain assumptions about, change some of our content assumptions and open the door to a new intellectual realm. And Julian Rose's Hegel Contra Sociology was the book that we picked because we thought, one, Hegel as a figure that is a post-Enlightenment, appreciative of Enlightenment, a thinker that is both very critical of Kant, could be a very good starting place. And also the fact that the book was not just about the scholarship of philosophy, but it was actually about sociology, made us interested in the whole point about disciplinary boundaries. Through that book, we decided to go back to the basics of Hegel and see how this idea of dialectically developing concepts, as opposed to simply assuming the distinctions between concepts, could actually play out within a philosophical system. Now, what you're going to see from now on is a direct result of our dissatisfaction with Hegel's project. And in spite of the fact that Hegel is going to be present in our conversations one way or another, we find a major flaw in Hegel that we don't think is a matter with Hegel, but is a matter with almost any thinker that we have faced. Before saying what that problem is and how we are going to go about this, Tran, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. I think I just want to kind of share my reflections. I'm kind of on a personal note side with the listeners how the first season, so to speak, of Versucher project has meant for me. First, as one is like approaching the end of one's the PhD, feels like intellectual activities become more and more like work. But Versucher is like the channel or the platform where I find a balance between work and play. That it's like a sympathetic, it's a charitable environment in which it's a thinking aloud in front of everybody. Yet play in this sense is not like defined by a very rigid rule, but also it doesn't mean it's not serious and not engaging or enriching. So I really want to see this spirit of like playing, self-development continuing in this community. A second is just to reiterate what you said. Like I really want to emphasize that in academic education at the beginning of the semester, the professor always like produces magically a piece of paper. It's called the syllabus, and it lists all the books so one has to read, and it will be tested on at the very beginning. So the direction is decided, and the content is predetermined. But our project, as Aran has just explained, is the opposite. It's open ended. We started with Isaiah Berlin's essays. I didn't think I would read like Hegel at all. But then question led us gradually to Hegel contra sociology, and now here we are. We didn't, as you will listen to it in a second, that the theme of this second season, so to speak, will be on human nature. And as Aran said, it's a direct result of our profound disappointment and the lack of engagement or lack of critical self-examination we detected in Hegel's not just a logic of science, but also reason and history. And by peripheral reading, we know that it was not just a problem of his own, but also belonged to his time and also to our time. So yes, with those said, I think we can proceed to like the themes of the tentative themes at least of
Mhm.
that second season.
Yes, and yes, it's important that you noticed and mentioned point that like when we I think the final blow for us was reason and history in Hegel because we thought that might be the place that we find the justification for some of his axioms, but we only found more axioms, right? And I think the idea here is like all of these axioms that we try to discuss in our critical remarks for both Hegel's logic and also reason and history, we kind of boil it down to the assumption about human nature. And the quote that you're seeing here from Hume that we probably will not be, you know, much interested in the content of Hume's view on human nature, but we are definitely becoming very sympathetic to the idea behind it because we agree with Hume that every human discipline, every study of not only humanity but nature itself, Hume mentions mathematics, natural philosophy, natural religion, in some measure dependent on the science of man, right? What is it to be a human being? And we have boiled down many like reasons for why like human nature uh, is going to be the center of our discussions, and we're going to talk about those. Just remember that in all of this, the dialectical nature of our conversations, which has that kind of a work play element in it, um, is going to be live, meaning that if we find that in our discussion about human nature, there is something else that is actually, very much kind of like essential in their discussion, we will we will have this flexibility to pick that. But for now, it's human nature, and we have 6 reasons for why human nature. The first point I mentioned, and Trent also pointed out, came from us through Hegel, but definitely it's not about Hegel. And that's human nature as axiom. Human nature is something that is just simply presupposed, and then a whole system is created out of it. Now, if you think about like 101 economy textbook, right? Macroeconomy textbook, that's applicable as much to that book that it is to Hegel, right? That there seems to be that every human discipline has an understanding of what is it to be a human being on a basic level, and then it proceeds from there. For Kant and Hegel, this axiom about human nature is some version of like rationality, and that's a very kind of enlightenment assumption too. And the role this axiom plays is very interesting in many ways, but the part of it that is the most problematic is like the prescriptive aspect of it, right? As if like, okay, here we have this, so we know what the human nature is, right? That's what we know. Let's see how we can kind of articulate it to the fullest, right? And in many ways, that's uh, a project that both Kant and Hegel share. Now, for Kant, this articulation in practical life is a moral achievement. For Hegel, is a socio-political achievement. Sure. But the point doesn't change. And they have different understandings about reason and how reason is connected to understanding, and understanding is related to sensations. Of course, they're very different. But it seems like that, if you ask Kant and Hegel, what is at the core of humanity? What is at the core of the whole thing about humanity is rationality. And it's not like they're not interested in like saying that, oh, you know, there is no core. There's like a cocktail of like traits. There's no such a thing. There is a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is very clear, right? And so within philosophy, within enlightenment, there are some assumptions. A counter-enlightenment figure like, Vico may have a different assumption about human nature. And our point is not so much about, who has what axiom of human nature, but how pivotal it is for human nature to kind of determine the rest of the inquiry. And when we change, we make a little bit of a change in that assumption and that axiom, the whole system changes, right? Now, we can still say that, if we assume wrongfully, let's say, that dance is part of human nature, that false assumption could lead us to interesting places about humanity, right? But that is not to say that there are also gonna be things that we're gonna miss that we don't know we're missing. I think that's the point that I'm trying to put across, meaning that with a wrong axiom, doors could be still opened, right? In so far as rationality in this specific way is concerned, Hegel's logic could have a lot of value. But that doesn't tell us anything about humanity as a whole, right? Which seems to be the end point. Like Hegel gets to a political place, Kant gets to a kind of a socio-political place in a moral sense. Hume goes to a political sense. Mill goes to a political place. Hobbes goes to a political place. Rousseau goes to a political place. All of these are just very practical measures about humanity, rest upon axioms about human nature. And we think that makes the concept very interesting as a center of focus. Now, Trent, tell us what you have about that, and tell us also about the second point.
Yes, absolutely. I'm a cultural historian here, so examining axiom and see how an axiom gains currency and like subscription in a society and is supported and reinforcing other axioms is essentially my profession. And but the really interesting thing here is the fact that Kant and Hegel had such a articulation of vision of human nature as a rational being was conditioned by their time in the sense that certain types of scientific knowledge became possible. But on the other hand, their proposition of human beings as rational beings are also structured the way science and knowledge is operating or constructed in our time. So it's a very interesting subject-object dialect here, just through the concept of the axiom, and that the first, the most one you can almost say primitive understanding of human nature, it's already leading us to the most interesting and for me most exhilarating topic. But what so much for this. Let's talk about the second one, the dialectic of the disciplinary boundaries, because as we were examining Hegel, it was really appealing to us at the very beginning because he was very aware to a certain extent the problem of a Kantian method. That is, in certain scientific inquiry and Hegel's understanding, that the method to examine and share or reevaluate certain assumptions that is predetermined and is not vulnerable or improved by the empirical analysis. And human nature seems to us this field is dominated by the axiom claim, and each disciplines, as you just mentioned, economics, in religious studies, we have like different schools of thought about the relationship between ritual and human well-being. Economics, some economists would say we are ultimately self-interested rational beings, so all economic behaviors that are ultimately based on rational choice. But some other economics would say actually we can modify the axiom and get a different branch of economics. So we have like classical economics and also behavioral economics nowadays. So what we observe basically in our for the past century or so of scientific development in humanities and social science is a proliferation of disciplines. Each one starts with a different point, which has been kind of revisited and enshrined as an axiom. And that usually is, I think, is a degree really connected. It's a matter of degree, but that axiom is somehow connected with a less commented upon or acknowledged assumption about what a human being is. So on that note, we think, because we were reading different texts along the road and see this problem, this assumption, both at the methodological method, as Gillian Rose or Hegel pointed out, but also in terms of conceptual assumption about what a human nature is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. No matter you pick up any book from like human humanities or social science, you ask the big questions about, so how did you get into this dichotomy? How do you come up with this list of options? You come back to kind of a hint or a hunch, an impression of the writer or the kind of school behind the writer's assumption about human nature. So we think this will help. Using human nature as a topic would at least open the door for us to see how different disciplines come to be and interact, and perhaps we can use this as a kind of a Trojan horse to overcome the rigid barriers that separate disciplines in our time. So, to you.
Yes, I have not much to add to that. That was perfect. I just want to emphasize in like we, and I think this is related to the third point about the question of is the Supreme Court of Human Sciences possible, meaning that this idea that what human nature can do, like one way to think about it is that, like, let's envision the end of this, right? The end of this, we have a conception of human nature that we think is immune to the criticism that we can think of, right? We have a better conception of human nature, right? And the question is like, what can we do with that concept? And I think one of the main things was mentioned by Chen, which is like when we have that, it seems like we have a lot more than just a concept. We have a concept that immediately puts all the other disciplines into the movement, not only as its result, but as a process of its inquiry, right? Meaning that for us to focus on the concept of human nature, not only we are aiming at kind of activating the dialectic of disciplinary boundaries, but in one way, we have to do it immediately, right? We have to start by going to different disciplines, understanding that they are cutting things up in places that in many ways are arbitrary, and kind of like take something from it, break it, and kind of put it back to the inquiry, the investigation that is centered in the human nature. These fields could be evolutionary biology, anthropology, sociology, philosophy. All of these are kind of have things to contribute here, but all of them kind of set on certain assumptions about the human nature part and not really go as far as we want them to go. Now, the other question that this kind of arises is that do we think that, you know, we have humanities, right? We have like classics, we have anthropology, we have history, we have philosophy. One question that is interesting to us is that is this inquiry basically inquiry into human nature, basically the process of creating a supreme court of human sciences, meaning that if like an anthropologist mentions something, right, about this kind of 21st century version of ethnography, and in that there is a dispute, right, between that anthropologist and another anthropologist. Can we trace back that conflict to their conception of human nature? And then that Supreme Court would resolve this tension. Right? Or think about it cross-disciplinary, right? Evolutionary biologists say something about humanity. Cultural anthropologists say something very different about humanity, right? Put them together, could they kind of come back to a plane of conversation, a communication space that it's concepts, that it's a discipline that is itself meta discipline, just like Supreme Court is part of the judicial system, but it's kind of standing above all the judicial system, right? Is the inquiry into human nature a discipline of this kind? And we don't have an immediate answer to this question. It's just something that we are curious about, because there are a lot of tensions between different disciplines when they reach, like they try to access human related concepts, right? And not just with methodology and other tensions that we already know, but evolutionary biologists and literary analysts are not necessarily seeing eye to eye when it comes to questions about humanity, right? And sometimes it's not only about disagreement, it's about impossibility of communication, right? So when we use the term Supreme Court, it's not just adjudication, but also communication, maybe even more so communication. We wonder if we think of human nature as this axiom that is, stubbornly present in all of these disciplines, and build a language to think and talk about human nature that draws from all of these disciplines, but it doesn't belong to any of them, really, and it's its own thing, then what's going to be the relationship between that newly created discipline as this, transdisciplinary discipline and the other disciplines that have anything to say about anything that remotely related to humanity, right? And I think for both of us, both options are fascinating, right? If the result is that such a Supreme Court is impossible, right? That tells us something very interesting about humanity and communication and the concept of human nature and the role of axioms and so on and so forth. And if there is such a disciplinary measure, there is such a thing as a Supreme Court of Humanity based on the concept of human nature, then all sorts of other doors will be opened. Trent?
Yeah. I really, I'm fascinated by this articulation of this question because I think Supreme Court here is perhaps not like a Supreme Court of the U.S., but the Supreme Court of like the Holy Roman Empire, and it's like last decades. Like there isn't necessarily a standing army to enforce the decision, but I think human nature has the potential. This topic, this line of inquiry, has the potential to stir things up in the best possible meaning of this phrase, that we can go to perhaps say some scholar of jurisprudence say you think you already understand what is at stake in passing a legal judgment or like sorting out things, but do you really? So what is the justification of this? And if you trace this, you will see, oh, actually you're already making assumptions or judgment in a domain or field beyond your expertise, in which you're like absolutely naive. You have like perhaps an outdated vision of like evolutionary biology because you're like quoting the Bible and making a case. So like in that sense, at least in the top of the 2 points that you said, hopefully make scholars who are not just scholars, so all of us more curious about a different way to approach the same issues we're concerned about. And second thing is the indefinite article in this sentence that is a Supreme Court of human science possible. And then, because I'm interested in the concept of culture, so when we take human symbol making and culture systems, it's plurality seriously. So would the switch from one linguistic context, one cultural context to another, change the composition of such a whole communication system that you said of knowledge, a mutual, how to put it? It's not a competition, but like critical appraisal across these different branches. That do they follow different pattern once we change the cultural context? Is also a question I think could be raised and addressed in pursuing this inquiry. Are we doing this because we use English in the 21st century in the USA so that we have such a vision of this, or is something way more fundamental? Is it shared by different like cultural systems, value systems? So that is also a question dear to my heart. And back to you.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think that's actually good like transition to the next one because like we are mentioning this interesting point about human nature that how it it seems to be at the center of like every party we go to, this person is invited. It's just always present in everyone's parties. And it's just a matter of curiosity of like what this the role of this person is. Is this person that's making all these parties possible? Is this like some sort of you know a resemblance? Like when you mentioned the point about like the cultural differences that made me think about like even like the question of centrality of the concept of human nature, right? Even the fact that it is an axiom, even the fact that it becomes a problem, right? That itself could be up for scrutiny, because I'm not entirely sure. Just like people who are living under like the authority of Christianity culturally and even linguistically, institutionally, all of that, they have puzzles, right? They have certain puzzles to think about, right? Like for just the sake of argument, like they have a problem with like existence of evil, right? how should we make sense of existence of evil? And that becomes like a central theme, that what should we do with evil, right? And other topics that are just about the problem of will, right? Like things of that nature. Um, I'm not sure if the set of puzzles is a puzzle for every religion. Definitely, it's not. Like there could be a religious sensitivity or like institution that the question of evil does not emerge in the same way, at least, or the question of will doesn't become centralized the way that it was, centralized in medieval Christian philosophy or Islamic philosophy. Um, is human nature such a thing? Like, is human nature like a flawed concept that presents itself as something that is universal, but it's not? At the same time, though, there is something else that within the cultural context that we are having this conversation about, um, very particularly exciting about the concept of human nature, which is we have always had, as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, fascinated by the problem of universals and problem of individuals. And in this context, the way that we are understanding human nature, we can think of it as like, we belong to this universal called humanity. Um, and that's a universal. And then we have the individuals, which are us, which could be the case for, any other species, for instance, or any other concept. Like it doesn't need to be even like anything tangible. Like the problem of universals, like in Plato and like Hegel and people of that kind in philosophy, finds its place in like politics, mathematics, so on and so forth. But there is something fascinating about human nature and this problem, which is we're in it. We are the individuals. Like when we think about universals and individuals in mathematics, I'm not a number, but I am a human being. And that's a weird place to be. That we think that our interest in the question of universals and centrality of that question in practical domain in the post-Enlightenment era in the West um, finds it like there like meets this very interesting point about human nature, which reflects the same problem with universals and individuals, with the exception that we are the individuals. This is something exciting for us. And this is something that is going to be related to the last 2 points as well. Trent?
Yes, I just want to build on what you just mentioned. I think it's very interesting because the study of human nature, I think, and as I understand it, at this stage, in Anglophone academia, is usually connected with uh, social sciences and be like cultural anthropology, like sociology, that branch. But in French, the Francophone academia is la science humaine, it's the science of man. So you see the different languages are already articulated, one in singular form, the other in collective form, but they are addressing exactly the same phenomenon, what does it mean to be human? So that individual and universal dynamic interplay, I think it's really baked into human nature, and we all have stake in this because by understanding the collective term of human, I think it's we are enhancing or at least diversifying our understanding of ourselves, which I think most people, anybody who is listening to this program should. I think not should. I believe they agree self-knowledge is important for general human flourishing and well-being. The point I'll leave it to you. But I really like the point you just mentioned that we're in this. Of course, in many social contexts, we are reduced to a number. Contra what you just said, the election is happening, mind you. Yet, in human nature, this line of inquiry, this observer being observed and the method of observation, the boundary among these three are so blurry and not clear, it's a foregrounded as a problematic. It's just a kind of the grounding foundation of the field of inquiry. I think this is really precious. We're discouraged from like detaching ourselves from the whole process of analysis. Which reminds me, I was reading like The Occultist the other day, and in the 19th century was a very fascinating Russian thinker, Gurdjieff, that he proposes the concept called self-remembering. And I think that really describes the energy or the level of engagement I feel while I read about stuff on human nature. As his examples are very simple. So like when you are watching um, your watch to tell the time, you're either paying attention to the watch, its movement, and forget about yourself, or you're observing your very act of looking at the watch and forget about the watch. Very occasionally, in a very difficult way, for a fleeting moment, you are doing both at the same time. And for us, while doing human nature, we need to be online on both grounds. I think it's a really good challenge to bring this kind of self-remembering into the knowledge and self-knowledge production. So because there's no separation between the object and the subject, we are at the same time the subject, the observer, and also the object, the observed. So on that note, can you like lead us to final?
Yes. Yes, of course. I think I really I have told you before I really like this term of like self-remembering. I think this is a fascinating concept. I just wanted to add one brief thing to what you said and then finish this with the last point. And that's the idea of, I think that's what Chen mentioned here is a great way to understand like the methodological issue at hand here, right? And I think that's a very interesting debate on its own. For instance, if human nature is this type of a concept, meaning that I am what I am studying, right? And like in just kind of a core way, not just I'm studying my hand, I'm studying something else. Uh, is like a natural scientific method the method that we should use, right? Or a phenomenological approach is something that is suitable, or they are both necessary, and why if they're both necessary. So I think this point that this is self-knowledge, this is self-remembering, the subject is the object, and vice versa, uh, lends itself well to this methodological uh, conflict that also is one of the main reasons between like one of the main points of conflict between disciplines and how like the whole idea of court of appeal might come into play. Last point that we wanted to mention to you guys is in some ways less scholarly. Not that any of these are scholarly, but I think it just goes back to the very basic thing about Versucher and the very basic thing that Trent also mentioned about this kind of investigation and play. And what makes us like our original kind of criticism or dissatisfaction with the bureaucratic regime of academia is not just that it has all these intellectual problems, but also it is very prone to putting people in certain emotional conditions.
Mm.
And we are not interested in being stuck in those emotional states. And one of those is like loss of vitality, we can put it. And being turned into like a scholarly machine that produces material for academic concerns, but doesn't feel it, doesn't let those material kind of embody him or her. And I think when both of us think about human nature, when we talk about it, when we read about it, something in us comes to the foreground. And there is intellectual curiosity, there is all of these things that are more familiar with any sort of investigation, but there is an emotion, almost like an emotion that, when someone dances, emotions come out, like play music, like emotion, like there are some like very routine things that they experience, but it's also about like kind of like it seems like you open a door to an emotional palace, and then you can go around and there was just like all these rooms and doors that you can play with. Human nature does that to us, and it seems to kind of put us in the position of having a better understanding of human flourishing, about what is this human force within us and what can we do about it. And on a more like sober side of this, we can think about all sorts of concepts that are not only related to morality, which is like prescribing a way to a path to flourishing, but also even like medicine, right? The concept of health, right? How we are understanding mental health, for instance. That's a concept that is very much kind of we can trace back its core to the questions about human nature. And because this question is not about anything other than us, this concerns our flourishing and our health as much as anything else. And I think that's on the emotional side why we are so much drawn to this concept. Trent, any final thoughts?
Yes, just to perhaps to build on what you just said and a link on to the previous several points that we made. I think, well, I want to do this because I think I'm quoting somebody who says cultural history is essentially intellectual autobiography, and human nature gives us this platform to really consider things we cherish in our lives, all the identities we embody. And it reminds us that these identities are not fixed because, like the fundamental human one, we don't really know what defines human being, and our effort put into this understanding perhaps has a slight chance of changing its actual definition. So that really, at least, reassures me what I consider intrinsic part of like human dignity. Don't ask me what is a human dignity, is the possibility, the open-endedness of our inquiry, this discussion, but also possibility of what we can be as human beings. And I think on that, I think that hope of being something not determined or decided external to oneself, but having one's voice and like agent's intention felt in the self-making process is really important to human health or flourishing as I understand it. So that's why I'm really, really excited about this second season of Versucher. And thank you very much for being with us, Aran. And I look forward to our further communications.